and welcome to Indian Standard Time, a show that speaks to global thinkers and leaders and to people who have made their mark on the sands of time. Today I'm in conversation with John Ralston Saul, writer, philosopher, critic of globalization, and president of PEN International, a worldwide association of writers and authors. John, welcome to Rajya Sabha TV.
Thanks for having me on.
I'd like to start by asking you about PEN. What is PEN International? It's a global association of writers and authors. What do you do?
We invented the NGO. We invented the idea of civil society organizations in 1921. Joseph Conrad, Shaw, Galsworthy, Wells. Very quickly it spread around Europe, it spread around the world. I think the All India PEN Center was started with Tagore as the president.
Rabindranath Tagore?
Tagore, the great Tagore, in 1929, I believe. And it was about, came out of the trenches of the First World War. You know, we've been killing ourselves, why don't we talk? And it gradually evolved, still doing that, but also there are 850 writers in prison around the world today.
850 writers in prison around the world.
There are about 5 political leaders, there are maybe 7 businessmen, 2 bankers, no economists, very surprising.
So the world is a dangerous thing.
Well, clearly we're doing our job right.
Okay.
You know, there is an increasing tendency to just kill writers. I mean, Honduras, Mexico, Brazil, you know, they don't bother arresting you or beating you up. They just cut your head off and put it on a pike. But there are also all these new ways of misusing the internet, governments, private enterprise, the disappearance of privacy, privacy is central to freedom of speech.
Right.
So we work in all of these areas, defending languages which are in danger of disappearing, working for the translation of regional languages which are at a disadvantage faced by English and other languages. Okay. So it's very broad. We're in schools. We have a big school program, mainly in Africa, could fit here, helping kids who don't have middle class push behind them to get the strength that comes from knowing how to write and speak in public.
But to come back to the slogan or the idea behind PEN, which is the unhampered transmission of thought. And I saw that the PEN India chapter or the PEN Delhi chapter says that there's sort of freedom to read, to write, and to express. Now, what does that mean? What does the freedom of speech and expression mean to you? To us? What should it mean, especially in a globalizing world?
Well, I mean, you know, things actually mainly happen locally. Things happen in communities, they happen in cities, they happen in countries. Not that much actually is global. You know, a few things move around, not that much. So you really have to make sure that freedom.
So all politics is local and all writing is global?
Well, you know, the greatest novels.
It's local, sorry.
The greatest novels, the truly great novels are always about some village or some corner of a street. And if the writer is a genius, they get the absolute truth, like Rohinton Mystery's Fine Balance, which I think is one of the great masterpieces. And it's about this little group of homeless people. It's War and Peace. I mean, he actually gets to the heart of something, and so it's completely universal. And you can read it anywhere in the world, and you're not in Bombay or Mumbai, you're wherever you happen to be. So freedom of expression is not an abstraction, it's a reality of how we function as human beings together in a community. But and our charter very clearly talks about unhampered, but on the other hand says that the role of writers is not to, you know, cause hatred and we're trying to bring people together. But that doesn't mean we're writing propaganda or that we're being nice. We're not nice people. I mean, freedom of expression isn't about being nice and cuddly.
But your freedom and your freedom of speech could be my abuse. So you could, you know, where you stop, I could begin, and vice versa.
Well, you know, let's put it this way. Freedom of expression, I said, is not cuddly. Part of successful communities, democracies, people living together, is they learn how to talk to each other. Okay. That doesn't mean that it's all controlled and soft and delicate and, you know, not offending people. Actually, novels are meant to be disturbing. Poetry is meant to be moving and emotional, and it's not to be run through censors to make sure that it's all namby-pamby and soft. So a big part of a successful society is people learning how to have open conversations and criticism and debate, which is rough and tumble, and know when to stop. how in those debates not to go into violence. And in fact, the more you can have the open debate, the less violence there is.
Okay. But how does then that feed, if you say that poetry is not meant to be confined just to the reading room or to the living room or to the library?
Certainly not. It's meant to be in the public place.
And part of protest and demonstration?
Well, everything. I mean, protest demonstration is an organized form of that public debate. But, you go and look at Rumi and you look at how aggressive that is. I mean, why did kings always have fools in their courts? Because otherwise they were listening to garbage from people who didn't want there to be real debate. So the role of the fool was to be the intellectual who broke it all open and caused controversy.
But then how does that feed into the politics of power, for example?
Well, what part of functioning democracy, which is a very flawed system, blah, blah.
Okay.
Part of functioning democracy is that people who want power have to know that what are the limits of what they should do in a democracy. They know full well when they're pushing things to a point where it might lead to violence, where it might lead to something which is not democratic. So, to turn around and sort of say, well, the answer to, public order is to shut down freedom of expression. That's just nonsense. I mean, there is no example in the history of the world of limitations on freedom of expression leading to public order over the long term or even the medium term.
I lived in Russia soon after the disintegration of the Soviet Union.
Right.
And I remember very clearly, and of course you had the arguments between freedom of speech and expression in the new Russia. And then the new Russia controlled those freedoms too. So was that, this whole debate about democracy, which is much more comfortable with freedom of speech and expression. Would you agree with that?
Well, even I mean, there are different kinds. Every country's different. There are different ways to run places. There is no model. It does not come out of the United States. Whatever the English and the French think, they don't have universal values. They have local values. It doesn't come out of those places. India has its own way. It has many, many ways. It's got a long history with all these different ways. Lots of good people to look at. Lots of great writers, politicians, theoreticians, social habit. So, it has to find its local forms. Russia has a big problem, a big problem. Right now, Penn is running an enormous campaign in Russia because the current regime has just put a series of laws in place, which are all, they've learned a lot from the West in terms of propaganda. Pretending you're doing the opposite of what you're doing. I mean, all that stuff was invented in the 30s, right? And so they're pretending they're protecting children from homosexuals when what in fact they're doing is banning homosexual.
We'll talk about that because India has a big problem with the homosexual lesbian community. So hold your thought, John. We'll be back very soon. I'm going to take a break. We're going to take a very quick break, but we'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Indian Standard Time, and I'm in conversation with John Ralston Saul, writer, thinker, philosopher, and president of PEN International. John, your book called Voltaire's Bastards was issued more than 20 years ago. The poor French philosopher must have been turning in his grave.
No, he would have loved it. I mean, I think that, in many ways, the approach I take is very Voltairean, Socratic. It's very unaccepting of standard thoughts in place. And so what I was really saying was the people who are in power today claim they're the descendants of the Enlightenment and of, rational methodology. And in fact, people like Voltaire would roll in their graves and say, these are not my children. Mm-hmm. These are not my children. They're claiming to be my children.
But what is it?
So at most, they're my bastards.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. But the dictatorship of reason, what does that mean?
Well, what it means is, what it means is this, that ideology, ideology is called things like fascism or capitalism, but ideology is actually the belief that there's one thing that drives us all. Mm-hmm. And that the last few centuries in the West, and by extension other parts of the world, have been driven by the ideology of reason. And the difficulty is that when you say that humans are driven by a single quality or belief or method, you're in deep trouble, because that's a power argument. That's an argument that says, let's narrow this down.
But listen, what's wrong with power? After all, it's
No, there's nothing
power
wrong
that
with power.
changes the world, isn't it?
There's nothing wrong with power. I'm talking about the methodology.
Of power,
So that what is most interesting about human beings is when they admit that they have more than one quality. So practically it would be to say, yeah, capitalism's good, but so is socialism, and so is social democracy, and so is this, and so is that, so let's do it all at once.
Right.
And in philosophy, you'd say, well, let's not become overly obsessed by rationality. It's one of our qualities. But we also have ethics, which is of equal value. We also have imagination. I mean, capitalism didn't become anything without imagination. If you base capitalism on management, and management is an outcome of rationality,
But listen, you're Canadian.
then you're narrowing it.
No, but listen, John, you're Canadian. You're a card-carrying member of the capitalist world.
No problem.
So then how would you argue that, as you have, and you're a well-known critic of globalization. So how does that, on the one hand, you're arguing against globalization and you say it's not a mantra for all good. And yet this is a theme and ideology that's all pervasive.
So, first of all, what I'm saying is, if you actually balance rationality with ethics, with imagination, with memory and things, then you start to be more intelligent about what you're doing. Mm-hmm. You're not in an ideology anymore. You have doubt. You have movement. It's you could say it's an intellectual freedom of expression. Right?
Okay.
So the practicality of that is to say that capitalism has a very important role to play, but the history of capitalism shows that it does much, much better when government has a serious role to play, and when society is respected and there's a real role for society. And you don't believe that everything is driven through an economic prism.
So what's the role then of the free market?
The role of the free market is what it's always been, which is it's usually in history it's about the number 3 thing of importance in a society. It is a very important factor. It works best when it's properly regulated. You go right back to Mesopotamia. I mean, you go Adam Smith. It's always been exactly the same. The free market.
Smith is
misquoted badly.
Best known for his Wealth of Nations.
Yes. His great book is The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is about empathy and reaching out to people. And 95, just to make up a number, 95% of the people who go through economic schools and 99.9% of the people who go to management schools haven't read Adam Smith.
John,
they quote him. They quote 3 lines from him.
Okay, we quote Adam Smith. India is a new convert to the mantra of the market, to globalization, and now you're saying you're trashing it.
No, it's not what I'm doing.
We're just climbing onto your bandwagon.
No, I'm not trashing it. Adam Smith very carefully said, we need trade, we need the marketplace, we need capitalism. However, in order for it to function, it has to be properly regulated, there has to be this, it has to be transparent, there have to be taxes. If you read Adam Smith, he's talking like a good, open, balanced person. Someone like me is saying, I'm a self-employed writer. I earn my living globally, unlike a lot of the people who talk globalism. I've always earned my living globally through the selling of my books.
Okay, I'm going to read one of your own quotes. I cannot resist this.
No, go ahead.
Where this is how you've described capitalism. It was reasonably content under Hitler, happy under Mussolini, very happy under Franco, and delirious under General Pinochet. You've trashed it.
No, what I'm saying there is that capitalism thinks that it does best outside of democracy, and therefore you'll find it. When things are a little complicated and uncomfortable, the leaders of capitalism will very quickly go towards people who are authoritarian and anti-democratic. But actually, they don't do well in the long term. They do well in the short term under people like that. Actually, capitalism does best in wild and woolly democracies, where things are open, where people talk, where people invent. The more they get what they want, which is a controlled situation, actually the less well they do in the long run.
Mm-hmm. But then how do you look at this, this interesting relationship between the US and China, for example? China is hardly a capitalist country. It's a very communist nation. The Americans, who are free marketeers, perhaps not as much under Barack Obama, but nevertheless, that's the fundamental tenet of that society. And yet they have this very close relationship in power, in trade, and in enterprise.
What I'm saying is that the mantra of globalization was put together by a few people in the United States and Britain. It was to deal with a crisis in the Western economies that started in the 1970s. And they thought that they could kind of get out of this crisis by relaunching trade and doing a bunch of things. And they made a bunch of promises. And if you actually analyze, several decades later, what happened, virtually none of the things they said would happen happened. We didn't get growth. We didn't get rid of nationalism. We didn't actually get more competition.
So has globalization failed then?
I'm not against it. It's failed. In other words, it said it was going to bring more competition. It's actually brought the return of monopolies and oligopolies. It said it was going to bring growth. Most of the world, not India, not China, are struggling with growth because it didn't address the central problems. Does that mean
Which are?
Well, the central problems were that fundamentally there were about 5 problems in the Industrial Revolution. One of them was we didn't have enough goods. And that was the explanation for poverty and suffering. We solved that problem. We have a surplus of goods. We have a crisis in distribution. So today, 2 cities in China could provide enough goods for the world. So the old idea of competition based on there aren't enough goods, it's not true anymore. So in effect, that's why China already is turning away from globalization towards internal markets.
Okay, John, just hold your thought. We're going to take a very quick break, but we're back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Indian Standard Time, and I'm in conversation with John Ralston Saul, writer, philosopher, thinker, the president of PEN International. John, before we took a break, you were talking about how globalization has failed the world, correct?
Yeah.
And yet, countries like mine, like India, have cottoned on to this mantra as if it were, this hold-all solution to everything. You think we should go back to our roots to...
No, I think we have to. The real point is when you're going to have major changes, the worst thing you can do is follow a mantra. And the most interesting thing you can do is say, well, what is true about India? What's different about India? What should India do that's different from this? And I take one simple example. If you look at the agricultural world in India, the places that didn't listen to the globalist theories, the places that, for example, used cooperatives to change the dairy industry,
right,
have done very, very well. This is totally verboten in globalist theory, right? Where are the disasters in Indian agriculture? The people who follow the globalist theories. Because actually, industrialized agriculture doesn't fit with small holdings, poor farmers, the agricultural model. You have to think about it differently. You have to think about it in Indian terms.
So what is it about the elite, then, that doesn't listen to that small voice?
You have groups of people who are doing very well out of a certain form of capitalism in India. You can criticize it or not. There's a certain gated community side to it. There's a certain non-involvement in society about many of them, not all of them, but many of them. Have they really come to terms with the needs of India as a whole? That's, I suppose, the job of a government to ensure that taxes and laws function so that they do play a role. Remember that the big breakthroughs for prosperity in the West came from a combination of the free market and the toughness of government in taxing the free market and ensuring that that money went into public education, clean water. I listened to Professor Sen the other day at Jaipur. He said,
Amartya Sen.
Yeah, you can't really have a functioning democracy if you don't have schooling everywhere, public schooling.
So then how does that feed?
Not elite private schooling, public schooling.
But then how does that feed into the freedom of speech and expression and of yourself? For example, you're a writer. How does that feed into? How do you make that connection?
Well, that is in a sense the civil obligation that we all have, and I'm talking as a writer here.
Sure.
You have all these elements in society. One is the desire to make money, to do well. It's fine, good, good. But that has to be balanced by these other basic things. The breakthrough for middle-class society, the Western world, the breakthrough came through public education, clean water, orderly streets, taxes. That's how the breakthrough came. The actual large amounts of money that came through the marketplace were one factor. They would have destroyed the society
So what is the
had there not been the counterbalance.
So then what's the place of the book? Or what is the place of the word in societies like ours?
Well, it isn't actually about the writers. We're sort of there. We seem to have this talent.
You're the medium.
Well, we seem to have a capacity for picking up what's in the society, and we have a talent for turning it into something.
So you're telling a story about the society.
Well, in which people see themselves and find themselves, and that gives them the language and the ideas to do things. And that's why somebody like Voltaire was the most famous person of the 18th century, or Voltaire was the Tolstoy of the late 19th century. That's why Tagore was so important, because they're bringing language to people, and people use that language to express what they want.
And yet people like Salman Rushdie, whose book, The Satanic Verses, continues to be banned in India. What would you say to that?
Well, look, whenever there is a direct attack on freedom of expression, PEN is there and we will defend. Direct attacks on freedom of expression are precisely that. But the real, and we do that all over the world. And that's why there are 850 writers in prison. That's why there are the people dying that I talked about. But the big issue is the issue of getting people used to the idea that if they want to have a successful economy, if they want to have a successful society, if they want to have complicated civilizations, they have to maximize the space of freedom of expression, thicken the skin, learn to have debate without it turning into violence. That's an exercise. That's the development of a muscle. India does pretty well at that.
But
it falls off sometimes. India does pretty well.
John, does the banning of a book, does it diminish countries? In India, for example, we banned several books, films. Do you think that diminishes us as a people?
Yes, it does, because it's part of the public discourse. You want to have as much out there as you possibly can and learn through other methods to limit how things, people have to learn to limit themselves, but you want the debate to be as open as possible. Freedom of expression is this incredible value that human beings have, the ability to talk to each other, to disagree, to get quite excited about it, to get quite hot about it. And to sort of have a professional thin skin is not a helpful thing in a healthy society. You have to have a professional thick skin. Okay. And really wake up in the morning and say, I'm not going to allow this. I'm going to either turn away. There is that ability to turn away. I almost never respond when I'm under what I consider to be unfair attack. I respond when I think the attack is interesting.
Okay.
Not nice, but interesting.
So my last question, you've been described by my friend and colleague Nilanjana Roy as an interrogator of power. Do you agree with that description?
That's kind of nice, yeah. I mean, I think the job of writers is to make power uncomfortable. And in fact, to make the reader uncomfortable. We're not about comfort. Okay. We're about doubt and questioning. And I have absolutely I think I know a lot about power, and I have no difficulty at all with the idea that there are prime ministers and presidents and heads of banks out there who really get very upset when they see me. And I think, gosh, I must be doing my job.
John Ralston Saul, thank you so much for talking to us.
Nice to talk to you.
I'm afraid we have to leave it there. You've been watching Indian Standard Time, and I've been in conversation with John Ralston Saul, writer, philosopher, and president of PEN International. We will have another formidable global thinker for you next week. Till then, goodbye and good luck.